Using these prices in the context of the load data method here simply means that I want to store them in that input prices field. That field, however, wants a slice of float64 values, not a slice of strings as we have it here, and therefore we also must convert all these values to float64 values. Now we could do that here, right inside that for loop, where we read in these text lines here and store them as text. But here I'll do it in a separate for loop to keep every individual code snippet relatively short and understandable. And here I'll simply go through all my lines. So I have my line index and then the line value, and I use the range keyword to go through my lines. So every line will be a string. And then we want to add a new variable here, or a new variable with the shortcut that could be called prices, which should be a slice of floats. So we can create that with the make function and make such a float64 slice. And the length here should be the length of lines, of course, because we'll have the same number of items just converted to a different type. Inside of this for loop, we can then use the strconf package that's built into Go and that must be imported, which is a package that offers utility functions for converting text to other value types. And here we can then call strconf and call parsefloat to convert a string value to a float64 value, or get an error if things go wrong. So we should pass a string to parsefloat, and the string I want to convert, of course, is the line, so that text price we read in. And parsefloat then actually also needs the bit size of float that should be generated. So whether it's a float32 or float64 float. And here I'll go for a 64, which is pretty much the standard you'll use in almost all cases unless you have a reason not to use it. And as a result, we'll get back our float price or an error if things go wrong, as mentioned. So we want to check if we have an error, if that's not nil here, in which case I also want to return. And I also want to close my file, because that still is open otherwise. And I want to output an error message, where we could say converting price to float failed. And then again, we can output the actual error value for more details. So that's the base logic. Now we of course should store this float price that we got by converting this string price by storing this float price in this prices slice here. So inside of the for loop, after this if check, we want to access prices for the line index, which we can use since we use the length of lines to create this prices slice. And the value I want to store here, of course, is the float price, so that converted price. And now finally, at this point, it's this prices slice here that should be stored as a value for the input prices field. Hence, here at the very end of all this code, we should reach out to the job to which load data belongs. So use this job receiver argument here at the very end and set input prices equal to the prices we read in. But now it's really important that our receiver argument is of type pointer, which currently is not the case. Because otherwise, as you learned, we'll get a copy here and we would be setting the input prices on that copy, but not on the original value that was created by this constructor function here. Therefore, we must edit the load data method to receive a job that is actually of type pointer to tags included price job. And with that, we'll be able to successfully update and overwrite the input prices. Therefore, now we could, for example, go to the process method to make sure that we call the load data method in there before we do anything, so that we guarantee that we do have these input prices read from that file. So in here, we can use this job and then call load data. And here I'll now also make sure that we actually get a pointer, not a copy, so that we're really still working on that original value that is returned by that new tags included price job constructor function. But with that, we're then calling load data on that value, and after we called that, we're performing our calculation, which is based on the input prices, which now come from this file. At least that's the plan. If we now save everything and we then run this application, we should still get a bunch of maps here as output, but now you can see that the prices on which these other prices are based are indeed coming from the prices.txt file. So this application is working the way it should. Now I just want to make sure that we don't have such very long, strange results like this, which you do sometimes get when working with floating point numbers. And therefore, to make sure that we don't get these strange results here, I'll go to the place where we perform the actual calculation and where we store the result, and I'll make sure that we calculate this in a separate step. So the tags included price is the result of this calculation here. And then we convert this to a string with that sprintf function here. So now it's the tags included price that should be converted to a string that also is formatted like this to only have 2 decimal places. Now, of course, at this point, I'm getting an error here because we're now generating a string and we're telling Go that we plan on storing a float64 value, which is not correct anymore. And therefore, I'll change this type here to string so that we do get a map with string values. And with that, this error is gone. So therefore now, if we run this again, we got this cleaner output. And the application therefore is working the way it should, now with that extra functionality of reading those prices from a file.